Today I want to share with you a really fascinating story about a Russian Tsar and a Russian holy man, and the rather intriguing possibility of their close connection. The Russian Tsar is the Emperor Alexander I, the grandson of Catherine the Great, and the holy man is a Siberian hermit, now a saint, called St Feodor Kuzmich. Tsar Alexander I came to the throne rather unexpectedly in 1801 in difficult circumstances. In March of 1801, his father, the Emperor Paul I, had just moved into the newly built Mikhailovsky Castle in St Petersburg when a group of noblemen began to plot to oust him from the throne. The Emperor Paul was increasingly unpopular among the nobility and the populace at large, primarily for his social reforms, his discovery of significant corruption in the royal exchequer, and his autocratic and at times somewhat erratic behaviour. On the 23rd of March, this group of conspirators burst into the emperor's bedchamber in the Mikhailovsky Castle and found him cowering behind some curtains. After trying and failing to compel him to sign an instrument of abdication, things quickly got out of hand. One of the conspirators struck him on the head with either a sword or a heavy snuff box, and then the rest set upon him. They strangled him, they stamped on him, and they left him for dead. All this took place while his 23-year-old son, Alexander, was elsewhere in the palace. He is said to have approved of the plot to oust his father, but I don't imagine for one moment that he approved of how things then developed. He was told of his father's death by the man who struck the fatal blow, Count Nikolai Zubov, who is said to have declared that it was time for Alexander to grow up and to rule. At that moment, Alexander became Tsar, the Emperor Alexander I. Not wanting to ascend the throne as the accomplice of regicides, there was a cover-up. The English-born court physician James Wiley declared that the late Emperor Paul had died of an apoplexy of a stroke. Alexander's reign would include one of the most turbulent periods in European history, with the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte and the chaos he wrought. The Russian crown and nobility were Francophile, and at first Alexander's relations with Napoleon were friendly. He and Napoleon met both in 1807 and again in 1808, and a treaty was signed between them. However, that relationship deteriorated in 1811, and in 1812, of course, Napoleon attempted rather disastrously to invade Russia and sack Moscow. After that, Alexander joined the alliance that would, 3 years later, defeat Bonaparte. Like his father, Paul, the Emperor Alexander I was a reforming emperor, liberalising Russia and getting to work pretty much immediately, making its political structures more efficient. The Russian emperor was still an autocrat, and Russia was still operating under a feudal system, with a large proportion of the population of his empire comprising an underclass of serfs who had little or no freedom. Alexander cautiously moved forward with the beginnings of their liberation, giving all Russians for the first time the right to own land. But that resulted in turn with harsh backlashes from the nobility, those who were the advocates of serfdom. The turbulence and great difficulties of Alexander's reign are immortalised in Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace. "Uneasy is the head that wears a crown," wrote William Shakespeare of the future English king Henry IV, who had usurped the throne of England and overseen the death of his predecessor Richard II. Alexander I of Russia must have been uneasy in his conscience, and in the last years of his reign, in his early to mid-40s, there were signs that he was becoming mentally unstable. He became withdrawn, suspicious of others, and increasingly pious. Countess Edling, a friend of Alexander's wife, the Empress Elizabeth Alexeyevna, wrote of this period in the emperor's life that he was discouraged and unhappy, that he found consolation only in solitude, which brought him to a higher level of consciousness, away from this world full of disappointments and miseries. It has been suggested that Alexander had schizophrenia, but such a change in mental outlook could easily be the result of the effects of prolonged stress and of a troubled conscience. Tsar Alexander I dies in odd circumstances. Both he and his wife, the Empress, were by 1825 in very poor health and run down. She seems to have developed a lung disease and a nervous condition, and he develops an infection in his leg, as well as the deterioration in mental health. They made the decision that they would move to warmer climes, and they moved nearly as far south as you can get in Russia. In October of 1825, they move and settle in a small house that they'd stayed in before in 1818, in the town of Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. The house they lived in is a simple one-storey house built in 1806 in a simple classical style, and is now a children's sanatorium. From there, in November of 1825, Alexander sets out to visit the Crimea, but when he returns, he is clearly unwell, and he dies in the house on the 1st of December 1825. The cause of Alexander's death is disputed. The official version is that he died of typhoid fever. Some have suggested he might have died of pneumonia, or even that he took his own life. His coffin was immediately closed, and it was then taken north for burial in the St Peter and St Paul Cathedral in St Petersburg, and is buried there on the 13th of March. When it arrives and the coffin is opened and his body is seen, a number of people remark that the body doesn't look like that of the emperor at all. His widow, the Dowager Tsarina Elizabeth Alexeyevna, does not travel with her husband's cortege, but travels separately and later, and she dies in May of 1825 on the way to St Petersburg. From the 1860s onwards, there had been persistent rumours in St Petersburg that there was no one buried in the emperor's tomb. It is alleged that when the Bolsheviks opened the tomb of Alexander in 1921, that it was found to be completely empty, that there was no coffin and no body within. What could account for this? Well, at the time of the emperor's demise in 1825, and ever since, there have been persistent rumours that Alexander I did not die in December of 1825, but that he disappeared, that he moved to the remote town of Taganrog in order to stage his own death and to free himself permanently from the stress of his position, and that he then went on to live out the rest of his days in rather different and more obscure circumstances. In September 1836, 11 years after the death of Tsar Alexander, a man called Feodor Kuzmich appeared in the town of Krasnovinsk in Siberia, acting very oddly indeed, and a local blacksmith reported him to the authorities. Kuzmich was promptly arrested. He appears to be around the age of 50 to 60 and had marks on his back suggesting that he'd been flogged. He had no papers on him whatsoever and told the police that he was illiterate, that he was a devout Orthodox Christian, and that he had no memory of his childhood or his origins whatsoever. He was put on trial for nothing other than his vagrancy, then a crime, and he was flogged once again, which was a standard punishment for that crime, and was then shipped off to the more remote town of Tomsk, further into Siberia, which was a common place to send ne'er-do-wells and exiles. It was a harsh place to live. Feodor worked in a distillery in an exile settlement for 5 years, after which he then wandered off into the inhospitable wilderness and wasn't seen again for another 15 years. In 1852 he turned up again, and a local merchant built him a hut on the outskirts of Tomsk, and this is where he lived for the remainder of his life. There is a description of his tiny hut which is a far cry from the gilded palaces that Tsar Alexander would have lived in. His hut was a single room with a tiny vestibule leading outdoors, a sort of mud room, in which hung a heavy winter overcoat. The cell itself measured 11.5 by 14.5 feet and was sparsely furnished, containing only a rough wooden table with 2 or 3 chairs and a cot with wooden slats that served as a mattress, together with a pillow and a heavy quilt. In addition, there was a small stove, a couple of benches and a shelf. On the table lay a Bible and a prayer book, and a wall shelf contained a crucifix and a display of icons with a votive lamp that burned day and night. The 2 small windows provided little light. In freezing winter, however, the room was warm and cosy. Visitors invariably remarked on the tidiness and cleanliness of these Spartan quarters. Feodor spent the rest of his life dedicated to prayer, living in this simple place. There's a wonderful painting of him showing him in this hut, dressed in his simple peasant clothing and with a distinguished white beard, every inch the holy man. People did notice that as well as a life of holiness, there was something distinctly different about Feodor. It became clear to those who encountered him that he was both highly literate and also well educated. He wrote in a very clear hand, and when speaking with army officers from the local garrison, he could speak French fluently, something uncommon among the peasant classes, but not uncommon among the higher social classes in Russia at the time. French was the language of the royal court. He intentionally avoided speaking directly about his own past, but he told stories about life in St Petersburg and Moscow in his youth, implying that he'd been at the imperial court and had mixed in higher social circles. When speaking of the patriotic war of 1812, when Bonaparte invaded, he hinted that he knew many of the Russian commanders in the war personally. Rumours began to circulate from soldiers in the region who had served in St Petersburg and Moscow that Feodor had a strong physical resemblance to Alexander I. The rumours began to spread that he was indeed Alexander who had gone into hiding. Apparently, on his deathbed, the priest who came to give him his last Holy Communion is said to have asked him outright if he was Tsar Alexander. Feodor simply responded, quoting from St Luke's Gospel, "There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." He didn't say yes, but he didn't deny it. Feodor's piety, his asceticism and his kindness made him well beloved of his neighbours. They considered him as starets, an elder, and a large number of people found their way to his hut for his wise spiritual counsel. A number of miracles are said to have been performed by him in his life and after his death at his grave. His grave indeed became a place of pilgrimage, and the sanctity of his life was acknowledged in 1984 when he was declared a saint by the Russian Orthodox Church. St Feodor Kuzmich's relics were exhumed from their original grave and are now kept in a new shrine in a chapel in Tomsk, where they are still the focus of pilgrims' devotions. After Feodor's death, rumours began to circulate more openly that he was in fact Tsar Alexander. Those rumours circulated among the highest social classes in Russia. Even in the mid-20th century, there were lots of Russian nobles that believed he was Tsar Alexander. There were rumours that in 1837 Tsarevich Alexander, the nephew of Alexander I, visited Feodor in Tomsk, and it is alleged that he was supported financially some way through the imperial coffers. After his death, it is known that the future Tsar Nicholas II also visited his grave, and it's rumoured that Tsar Alexander III had Feodor's portrait on his study wall among portraits of his illustrious predecessors. Leo Tolstoy also played his part in cementing this legend in the 20th century Russian consciousness. In 1912, he published a short story, Posthumous Notes of the Hermit Feodor Kuzmich. It is narrated from the point of view of Alexander I, who Tolstoy has receiving a spiritual awakening and conversion, and has him giving up all to live as this mysterious hermit. There are lots of people to this day who still think that Feodor Kuzmich and Alexander I are one and the same person. Recently, Svetlana Semyonova, president of the Russian Graphological Society, has conducted an analysis of examples of both Feodor and Tsar Alexander's handwriting, and she has concluded that they are one and the same hand. The truth we may never know, unless the Russian Orthodox Church expose the relics of St Feodor to scientific and DNA analysis. They've not ruled out that possibility. It is a wonderful story. There's something rather compelling about the possibility of an emperor giving up his life of politics and state in a gilded palace to become a holy man dwelling in a wooden hut. Here we have a man in Alexander I who, by accident of birth, finds himself as the emperor and autocrat of all the Russians, in a position of supreme authority, a man who from his youth has been embroiled in conflict and controversy, a man implicated even in his own father's demise, a man who's had to make tough decisions that have affected ordinary people's lives and has found his conscience increasingly pressed and weighed down by them to the point where he can no longer abide it. There is little way out of that sort of situation except perhaps a radical plan and a radical amendment and change of life. If the mysterious starets Feodor Kuzmich is Tsar Alexander I, he seems to have found some peace with his conscience and made a very serious amendment in life. For a genuine holiness, a genuine humility, and a genuine nobility of spirit was self-evident in that man to everyone who knew him. Thanks for watching.